Charles Gounod's melodious opera Romeo et Juliette has been called a love duet with occasional interruptions. That blithe evaluation is not far off the mark. For operatic purposes, Shakespeare's play was drastically reduced by Gounod, his librettists, and his theater managers to the scenes between the two lovers. The other characters, Capulet, Tybalt, Paris, and Benvolio, and even Mercutio, Friar Lawrence, and the nurse, all lose a dimension and a half as they pass from Shakespeare's speech to Gounod's song. But what matters most is that the glory of Shakespeare's play, its poetry, does find its way into Gounod's opera, in the music. The young dramatist was drunk with the power of his own words when he wrote his play, and the composer, too, when he rises to the challenges of Shakespeare, can seem carried away by the power of his melody. In orchestral music like this, which seems almost to define romantic passion. And in vocal music like this, as young Juliette thrills to the promise life holds for her. That might be thought a musical description of how the young Shakespeare's genius sings in his Romeo and Juliet, in dazzling patterns of imagery about suns and stars, day and night. "Come, gentle knight," his Juliet apostrophizes, "give me my Romeo, and when he shall die, take him and cut him out in little stars, and he will make the face of heaven so fine that all the world will be in love with night." Similarly, Shakespeare's Romeo whispers in wonder when he first sees Juliet. "She hangs upon the cheek of night like a rich jewel in an Ethiop's ear." Throughout the play there are patterned references to stars, from the rhapsodic, "Night's candles are burnt out, and jocund day stands tiptoe on the misty mountain tops," to the desperate, "Oh, I am fortune's fool, then I defy you, stars." The poet's imaginative web is woven of such patterns. Can a composer hope to match this when he turns Romeo and Juliet from poetry to music? A few have come close. Gounod gives us music that is often rapturous and sometimes ravishing. He gives us not only passionate song, but patterns of recurrent phrases and delicate luminous orchestral details. His music has sometimes been compared to painting, another art in which he was skilled. But above all, his music is, as I hope we will see together in this commentary, poetry, musical poetry that is elegantly Gallic in its piquancy and sentiment. The play has been adapted by artists over the centuries more than 100 times. The Annals of Opera alone list some 32 versions, 33 if we count Delius's A Village Romeo and Juliet, with its concert favorite, A Walk to the Paradise Garden, and 34 if we count Leonard Bernstein's West Side Story, with its meltingly beautiful ballads and intensely rhythmic dancing. Prokofiev's sumptuous 1938 ballet is only one of several other Romeos written to be danced. And there have been at least 20 film versions of the play, some of them with elaborate musical scores. My favorite is not the popular Zeffirelli version from 1968, but the now curiously neglected J. Arthur Rank filming directed by Renato Castellani, which won the Golden Lion at the Venice Film Festival in 1954, where it beat out Kurosawa's Seven Samurai, Fellini's La Strada, and Kazan's On the Waterfront. In addition to its lovingly photographed settings in Siena, Assisi, Mantegna, and the Ca d'Oro in Venice, it has astonishingly beautiful music by Roman Vlad. In painting, the English have been foremost in depicting the various scenes of Shakespeare's play. But the artists most fascinated by Romeo and Juliet were 19th century Romantic composers. Alexandre Dumas likened the French Romantics' discovery of Shakespeare to Adam's awaking in the Garden of Eden on the morning of his creation. Berlioz, overwhelmed when he saw performances of several of the plays, even in a language, English, that he did not know, proclaimed that the English were quite right when they called Shakespeare the supreme creator. Berlioz fell frighteningly in love with the first Juliet he saw on stage, Harriet Smithson, and eventually he married her, with disastrous results. But his infatuation led to the composition of what he called a dramatic symphony on Romeo and Juliet, a marvelous work almost 2 hours in length, with occasional vocal parts and an orchestral balcony scene that may have given Wagner the famous yearning theme for Tristan und Isolde. And finally, the young Tchaikovsky wrote what he called a fantasy overture on Romeo and Juliet that has long been a concert hall favorite, a spellbinding piece filled with tempestuous orchestral sword fighting and truly impassioned love music. Gounod's opera premiered only a year or so before Tchaikovsky wrote that overture. Almost certainly the two composers were unaware, each of them, of what the other was putting to paper. But Gounod certainly knew Berlioz's work. He said he was haunted by it. He may have known as well the bel canto opera The Capulets and the Montagues, I Capuletti e I Montecchi, by Vincenzo Bellini. But if so, Bellini did not influence Gounod much, for the traditions of the two composers were quite different. And in Bellini's opera, based less on Shakespeare than on Shakespeare's sources, Romeo is sung by a lady, Lawrence is not a friar but a doctor, and Mercutio and the nurse never appear. Gounod's opera was more successful initially than any of its operatic predecessors because of his surer sense of what would work on the stage. And if the words of his text, by the team Jules Barbier and Michel Carré, who had fashioned his Faust libretto for him, are not always close to and often considerably inferior to Shakespeare, the reason is that the librettist used not the English text, but a widely known French version by Victor Hugo. The poetry of Gounod's opera is not in the text. It is in the music. Now we can turn at last to a discussion of the opera, and I hope you will understand if, in telling the story, I quote from Shakespeare when the French text comes close to his original, and pronounce the characters' names as they are pronounced on the English stage. And if, referring to the opera and its characters, I Gallicize the names. Gounod begins with an ominous theme that sounds to a later generation of opera lovers like the last calamitous orchestral shout in Cavalleria Rusticana. Then we hear an almost Tchaikovskian tempest of sword fighting. Then a fugue-like passage depicts the endless strife between the two families of Verona, the Montagues and the Capulets. And then, as in Shakespeare, we have a prologue, which Gounod gives to an unseen and unaccompanied chorus. It is a fairly close French translation of the words of the young English dramatist. Two households, both alike in dignity, in fair Verona where we lay our scene, from ancient grudge break to new mutiny, where civil blood makes civil hands unclean. From forth the fatal loins of these two foes, a pair of star-crossed lovers take their life. Here are the first lines in Gounod's setting. Gounod follows this with an extended melody at once tender and tragic that will recur several times in the opera. The curtain rises on a spacious room in the Capulet Palazzo, where the best of Veronese society, with the conspicuous exception of the hated Montagues, is gathered together at a masked ball to celebrate the birthday and the coming out of the family's young daughter, the beautiful Juliette. We're in a 14th century Italy that knows nothing about the 19th century waltz, And yet Gounod had had such success introducing his Marguerite in the midst of swirling waltzes in Faust, and he had added to his Mireille another sweeping waltz for the heroine, that the temptation to set the Capulets waltzing, and later in the first act to give Juliet a sparkling waltz to sing, was too great to resist. Besides, Juliet was to be sung by that same leading lady who had demanded waltzes when she sang the first Marguerite and the first Mireille, Madame Miolane Carvalho, the wife of the manager of the Théâtre Lyrique in Paris, where all three operas were premiered. The opening Capulet waltz is a real rouser, practically a mazurka, punctuated by vigorous kettledrum whomps. Our conductor, Alain Lombard, subdues the whomps somewhat. Capulet welcomes his guests, and Juliet appears with her nurse. The assembled company, among them her suitor, the wealthy Count Paris, exclaim, "Oh, how pretty she is!" Juliet is granted just a bit of coloratura wonderment, the passage we heard a few minutes back, before her father urges the company to further dances off stage. Then, unnoticed at first, a group of Montague stalwarts crashes the party in capes and dominoes. Among them is young Romeo, who is wary about the escapade and fears some consequence yet hanging in the stars. He has had an ominous dream. His friend, Mercutio, a swashbuckler who has a way with words, says, "Oh, Queen Mab has been with you," and he launches into a capital song about Mab, the fairy midwife. In Shakespeare's Quicksilver verses, she comes, drawn with a team of little atomies athwart men's noses as they lie asleep, her wagon spokes made of long spinners' legs that cover the wings of grasshoppers, the traces of the smallest spider's web, and in this state she gallops night by night through lovers' brains, and they dream of love. It was a challenge for Gounod to set that gossamer rhodomontade to song, especially as Berlioz had already given it classic orchestral form, complete with tinkling antique cymbals, in the Queen Mab scherzo of his Romeo and Juliet. Here is how Gounod, with some charming instrumental touches of his own, rides the wings of Mercutio's fancy. Our Mercutio, singing about Mab, is Henri Guy.
La reine des mensonges préside au songe, plus légère que le vent décevant. À travers l'espace, à travers la nuit, elle passe, elle fuit, elle passe, elle fuit, elle passe, elle fuit.
Romeo still has his premonitions, but then his eyes fall on Juliet. It is the classic instance of love at first sight. He had thought till then that he was in love with the fair Rosaline, but Juliet doth teach the torches to burn bright, and when she sings, our Juliette is Mirella Freni, and her words, more Barbier and Carré than Shakespeare, joyously proclaim that she is not interested in marriage with Count Paris or with anyone else. I want to live in this dream, she sings. While I am still young, I want laughter and love. It is a waltz, of course. Romeo follows Juliet with his eyes, somehow manages to speak to her in private, and, as he removes his mask for a few moments, we get the first of the 4 love duets Gounod lavishes on his young couple. In Shakespeare, Romeo says, taking Juliet's hand, "If I profane with my unworthiest hand this holy shrine, the gentle fine is this, my lips, 2 blushing pilgrims ready stand, to smooth that rough touch with a tender kiss." And, keeping the metaphor, her witty refusal is, "Good pilgrim, you do wrong your hand too much," which mannerly devotion shows in this, "For saints have hands that pilgrims' hands do touch, and palm to palm is holy Palmer's kiss." Here, with the same thought but to simpler verses, is part of Gounod's madrigalesque setting, still in 3/4 time, of those words. Our Romeo is the ardent Franco Corelli, whose voice you may find rather too stentorian for Gounod's teen-aged hero. It is a duet as charming as the first meeting of Gounod's Faust and Marguerite, But it is, like that meeting, a brief encounter. For in the first of the love duet interruptions, Juliet's wary and dangerous cousin Tybalt calls her back to the dances. Romeo ruefully discovers that she is the child of the Capulets, and Tybalt recognizes Romeo behind his mask as one of the hated Montagues. Juliet, in sudden sorrow, exclaims, "My only love, sprung from my only hate." Now she has a premonition that her wedding bed will be her grave. And Romeo laments, "My very name is a crime in her eyes." Sword fighting might have broken out on the spot, but Juliet's father, not wanting anything to spoil his daughter's coming out, overlooks the incident, and as Mercutio speeds Romeo away, Capulet sets his guests dancing again, to a waltz, of course, the same giddy, mazurka-like waltz that began the Capulet ball. The second act is based on the most famous scene in the play, Shakespeare's balcony scene. Gounod's orchestra introduces it with musical magic. Romeo, heedless of the taunts of his friends, scales the garden wall with the aid of his page Stefano. A light appears in Juliet's window, and Romeo sings a rapturous aria based on the bard's "It is the east, and Juliet is the sun. Arise, fair sun, and kill the envious moon." Arise, fair sun becomes, in French, Ah, lève-toi, soleil. Juliet comes out on the balcony and wonders aloud, thinking she is alone. O Romeo, Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo? Deny thy father, and refuse thy name. He comes out of the shadows below, and they begin their second duet, he vowing to renounce his name, she insisting that he swear not by the moon, the inconstant moon that nightly changes in her circled orb. But before the duet can take wing, their vows of love are interrupted by cries from the retainers of the Capulet household, who have caught sight of Romeo's page boy. Juliet's nurse takes a cudgel to them, and, as Romeo hides in the shadows, she scolds Juliet for not being abed at the late hour. Then, when all is calm again, Juliet descends to the garden, and the lovers agree to marry, come what may. But once again the love duet is interrupted. They hear the nurse above calling Juliet to bed. They part with such sweet sorrow that I shall say good night till it be morrow.
Ne fui pas ancora, ne fui pas ancora, ce moment s'oublier da ta
The scene ends with the same music that began it, as Romeo takes his leave, praying, "Sleep dwell upon thine eyes, peace in thy breast. Would I were sleep and peace, so sweet to rest." The next morning, in the cloistered cell of Friar Lawrence, Romeo's kindly confessor, the lovers are secretly joined in marriage. The friar hopes thereby eventually to make peace between the two families. Gounod's librettist, writing for a bourgeois audience at the Théâtre Lyrique, expand Shakespeare in this scene by using the words of the marriage ritual of their day, climaxing in, "Romeo, do you take Juliette for your wife? And do you take Romeo for your husband?" The nurse is called to witness the ceremony, and the scene ends in a joyous quartet. Our Friar Lawrence, often called, even in performances of the opera in England, Frère Laurent, is Xavier Duprat. Michel Vilma is the nurse. Gertrude. Here, halfway through the third act, and halfway through the opera, we might pause for some obiter dicta. If you asked Charles Gounod what he thought he would most be remembered for, he would have said that his main contribution to music lay in his choral works. He wrote 17 masses, many sacred pieces, and 4 oratorios. Camille Saint-Saëns predicted, "In the distant future, when the operas of Gounod will be gathering dust in the archives of musical curiosities, his oratorio Mors et Vita will stand forth as a living illustration of the composer who brought glory to France in the 19th century." But in fact, Gounod is remembered today not for his once famous choral works, but for the least pretentious of his songs, for his little symphony for winds, for the Ave Maria that he wafted over the first of the preludes in Bach's well-tempered clavichord, and for that delightful bit of grotesquerie called the Funeral March of a Marionette, the theme of Alfred Hitchcock's television series, and originally a satirical portrait in music of one of Gounod's critics. And finally, Gounod is remembered for a few, perhaps only 3, of his 12 operas. You will note that all of these pieces are small in scale, even those operatic successes, Faust, Mireia, and Romeo and Juliette. They were all first envisioned modestly as opera dialogues, small-scaled musical plays with spoken dialogue. They were expanded, not always with Gounod's willing cooperation, when producers saw more commercial possibilities in their being turned into grander operas. Gounod actually failed in the theater whenever he strove to be grand in scale, like Meyerbeer, Halévy, and the other composers at the lavish Paris Opera. Most of Romeo and Juliette, his final work for the stage, was written at Saint-Raphael, on the Côte d'Azur. Gounod had not had a hit on the opera stage for 6 years, but he found that, composing this opera in the Mediterranean sun overlooking the sea, the music all but wrote itself. He composed non-stop, and he said excitedly about his lovers, "I can see them, I am with them, I believe in them." He was nearly 50, but he said that he felt like he was 20 again. Despite a flurry of frenzied last-minute revisions, cuts, and additions, in preparation the opera had reached the Wagnerian length of 3.5 hours, not counting intermissions, Romeo and Juliette premiered successfully in 1867. It was a well-timed premiere, for that same year Paris saw the opening of the Exposition Universelle, a celebration of the technological and cultural achievements of the Second Empire, and especially of the new, wide boulevarded Paris, spectacularly laid out by Georges Eugène Haussmann. At the imposing Paris Opera, Verdi's new and overlong Don Carlos, in French, was less than successful, but Gounod's shortened Romeo and Juliette at the smaller Théâtre Lyrique drew full houses night after night for almost 100 performances. Saint-Saëns wrote that all the women were singing Gounod's melodies and all the young composers were imitating his style. Thereafter, the work spread rapidly across Europe and then the world. It has surprised many opera fans to discover on the Metropolitan Opera website that Gounod's Romeo and Juliet was done so many times at the Met in its turn-of-the-century heyday that it ranks 24th on the list of performance totals, topping, to name only works by the greatest opera composers, Così fan tutte, Otello, Parsifal, Salome, and Turandot. Adelina Patti, Nellie Melba, Emma Ames, and Amelita Galli-Curci sang Juliette at the Met for many seasons. Geraldine Farrar made her debut there in the role. Jean d'Arresque set hearts throbbing as Romeo in some 50 Met performances and many more elsewhere. His brother Edouard sang Friar Lawrence, a small but grateful role, even more often, and the friar's robes were worn later by Paul Plançon, Léon Rotier, and Ezio Pinza, while Giuseppe De Luca, Lawrence Tibbett, and Martial Sanger did not think Mercutio too slight a role for their star appearances. The opera was chosen for opening night 6 times at the Metropolitan. Only Aida and Otello have had more of the glamorous nights. And Romeo ceremoniously closed the season at Covent Garden for 5 successive years. It opened the Chicago Auditorium in 1899, and on one notorious evening when the Met was performing in the new Chicago Opera House, Jean d'Arresque drew his sword and pinned to the scenery a crazed man who claimed to have the biggest brain in the world and leapt onto the stage in the balcony scene to prove it. d'Arresque held him at bay till 2 stagehands could take him away. Some women in the audience, they all loved Jean, were hysterical. Others fainted. The Juliette, Nellie Melba, was calmed down by the handsome tenor. He caught my hands tight, she remembered, and told me everything was going to be all right. Eventually, Jean resumed the performance where it had been, there's that word again, interrupted. He repeated his "Ah, lève-toi, soleil." But the most famous story in Romeo's performance history came earlier, when the haughty Paris Opera finally deigned to welcome Gounod's modest work, and Adelina Patti was singing Juliette. The famous diva was married to the Marquis de Caux in a union arranged by the Empress Eugénie. But she fell in love with her onstage Romeo, Ernesto Niccolini, and eventually she left her Marquis to marry her tenor, after they had planted, by report, 29 kisses on each other's eager lips during the balcony scene. Niccolini, too, was married, and for years he and Patti lived together openly and unwed. It was shocking at the time. But then Romeo and Juliet is an opera in which romance blooms quite naturally on stage. Lucrezia Borri and her Romeo, Edward Johnson, before he became the Met's general manager, were romantically linked off stage as well as on. And Nellie Melba described the experience of playing her first Juliet with Jean d'Arresque as, quote, the greatest artistic emotion of my life. It might be added that the composer himself was prone to exuberant kissing, of the social variety. According to the former critic of the New York Times, Harold C. Schoenberg, Gounod liked to be liked, and with his overpowering charm, there were few who could resist him. Henri Maillac, one of the Carmen librettists, told a friend, Gounod spent all day Wednesday and Thursday with us. Never have I been kissed so often in so short a time. The popularity of Romeo and Juliet declined as French operatic elegance yielded to verismo violence in the early 20th century. But Georges Thiel and Richard Crooks, Gilli and Gedda, Krauss and Domingo still sang Romeo thereafter. And recently Roberto Alagna became an overnight star in the role and has often sung it with his wife, Angela Georgiou, following the tradition set by the Montreal sweethearts of the airwaves, Leopold Simoneau and Pierrette Allary. Both Grace Moore and her protégée Dorothy Kirsten sang Juliette at the Met, and the film star Jeanette MacDonald toured in the role with her own company. Gladys Swarthout, also something of a Hollywood star, made a good thing of the little role of Stefano. And many listeners to the Met broadcasts still insist that the finest single Saturday afternoon performance came on February 1st, 1947, when the airwaves carried Gounod's Romeo et Juliette to millions of homes with the endearing Bidou Sayao and the incandescent Jussi Björling as the star-crossed lovers. I was listening that day. It really was wonderful. Well, let's return to fair Verona, where we lay our scene. We are outside the Capulet house. The boy Stefano, a character invented by Gounod's librettist, Eliane Lublin, in our recording, sings a serenade to his master's lady love. She should flee from her Capulet prison immediately. She's a turtle dove in a vulture's nest. That charming chansonette rouses the Capulets to fury. Their sturdy sons issue forth and engage in the "do you bite your thumb at us, sir?" mock courtesies that are the inevitable prelude to a Shakespearean street brawl. Gregorio, a Capulet ruffian, attacks young Stefano. The Montagues come to the rescue of the page boy, and soon, amid the general mayhem, Tybalt is engaging in a furious sword fight with the insouciant Mercutio. Romeo appears and tries to separate them. He is a Montague, now happily married to a Capulet, but his interference gives Tybalt the advantage, and Mercutio is carried off fatally wounded. Romeo, throwing all caution to the winds of fate, draws his sword to avenge his friend. Tybalt falls beneath Romeo's sword, and the newlywed youth despairs as he realizes suddenly that he has killed Juliette's devoted cousin. Capulet himself hurries to the scene, and the dying Tybalt whispers something in his ear. Then, to the sound of trumpets, the Duke of Verona arrives to restore peace to the streets. And because the Capulets demand satisfaction for the death of Tybalt, the Duke banishes Romeo from the city under penalty of death. The ensemble that builds up, added to the score when the opera opened at the Paris Opéra, is one of the most impressive numbers Gounod ever wrote. The agonized Romeo vows he will see Juliet one more time, despite the danger.
Oh, désespoir!
In the fourth act, before the dawn breaks and Romeo must leave Verona forever, he and Juliet have their one night of love. First we hear the tender, tragic theme that preceded the first act. Gounod will use it again and again now as the drama gains force. Then we hear the most famous of the four love duets. Juliet forgives her young husband for slaying Tybalt, and the two of them sing rapturously to the night that now envelops them. Their wedding night, their nuit d'hyménée. They hear a thin, insistent sound from outside the window. She asks why he is suddenly troubled. He, aware that when day comes he must not be seen within the city walls, is sure it is the song of the lark, heralding the dawn. She, as if to hold back the dawn, pleads, "No, it is not the day, it is not the lark, it is the nightingale, singing in the darkness."
See
Memorably, the situation is reversed. He resolves to stay with her, succumbing to her fantasy that it is not the lark, only the nightingale, that they hear. And suddenly, she, wise beyond her years, is sure that it is the lark that is singing. He must leave. Romeo leaves quickly by the balcony. He will flee to nearby Mantua. She asks the angels to protect him. And in another minute Juliette's nurse rushes in to warn her that her father and Friar Lawrence are approaching. Old Capulet tells his daughter that it was Tybalt's dying wish that she marry Count Paris. The preparations are already underway. Neither the nurse nor the friar dares to tell Capulet about the secret marriage the day before. Juliet is desperate. Gounod wrote a quartet at this point in which she adamantly refuses to marry Paris. But like much that follows, it was cut for the first performances, and only part of it survives. Juliet's father is sure that the holy friar will instruct her properly in her duty to the family, and he leaves her alone with him. She pleads with the friar to find some way to help her, and he, a master of the powerful grace that lies in herbs, has already thought of a way. He has concealed in his robe, for Juliet, a glass vial containing a potion that will induce in her a sleep as if of death for 24 hours. Time enough for the friar to dispatch a letter to Mantua, inform Romeo of the stratagem, summon him back to Verona, and steal him into the Capulet crypt. Then, when her funeral cortege has placed her there and departed, Romeo will wake her, and the lovers will flee the city together. Gounod underscores the friar's words with a memorable theme he called Juliet's Sleep. Juliet is left alone, wondering what will happen should the potion not take effect. She arms herself with a dagger, for if worst comes to worst, she will kill herself rather than be forced to marry another. Then, with the dagger hidden beneath her breast, the thought occurs to her that she might awake early in the vault where her ancestors lie corrupting in death, where Tybalt's bloodied ghost might rise up before her, and she almost gives way to terror. But, strengthened by her love for Romeo, she drinks the potion. Gounod wrote an elaborate aria expressing all of this, but it was too much for the first Juliette. The role is written for a type of soprano commonly called leggero, requiring lyric lightness and coloratura agility. But in the potion aria, Gounod suddenly calls for a heavier voice, a lyrico spinto, capable of more thrust and power. So the aria was cut at the first performance, and at most performances thereafter. We cannot play any of it here because its orchestration was not available at the time our recording was made. In fact, the publishing firm of Schoudens, which had made a fortune on Faust, wasn't even sure they had the orchestral parts for the Romeo potion aria anymore. The parts have since been recovered, and for a Juliet today who can manage it, the potion aria is the crowning moment of her performance. The next scene is also likely to be cut. Gounod wrote it when, after 20 years, his Romeo et Juliette was mounted at the Paris Opera, where, as Verdi and Wagner had already learned, a ballet was de rigueur in the fourth act of any presentation. So, in some performances, Juliet's wedding becomes the occasion for a ballet at the Capulet Palazzo. The divertissement is not particularly strong musically. Gounod's heart was never in these enforced ballets. Then, when the wedding procession has made its way to the doors of the Capulet Chapel, Juliet suddenly falters, remembers her premonition that her wedding bed would be her grave, and falls senseless to the ground. She seems, to the horrified company, to be dead. In the fifth and final act, there is one more very small cut made in most productions. Friar Lawrence discovers from Friar John that the message he has sent to Romeo has never reached him in Mantua. The page Stefano, who was carrying it, was waylaid by the Capulet toughs, and the letter lost. So the last act usually begins with an intermezzo based on Juliet's sleep music. And when the curtain rises, Romeo, who has heard in Mantua, falsely of course, that Juliet is dead, has returned secretly to Verona, resolved to kill himself in the crypt where she has been laid. "This is the place," he exclaims, when he forces open the door of the Capulet vault. He peers into the darkness and desperately sings that this is no charnel house, but heaven itself. He finds her motionless body formally laid out within, lifts his lantern to look upon her face, and sings to the extended, now familiar love theme, "Death hath had no power yet upon thy beauty." And then, eyes, look your last, arms, take your last embrace, and lips, O you, the doors of breath, seal all with a righteous kiss. He kisses her lips, and quickly drains a flask of poison he has brought with him. Then, to his amazement, Juliet wakes, gradually, to the sleep music. So the lovers begin the last of their 4 duets, based on the rising cadences of their wedding ceremony and other now familiar musical phrases. This is not, of course, Shakespeare, where Juliet wakes tragically only after Romeo has died of the poison. Gounod and his librettists, certain that both lovers must survive long enough to sing a last duet, avail themselves of a solution first proposed by the celebrated English actor David Garrick a century earlier. And at least one of Shakespeare's sources had also had the lovers die, not separately but together. Gounod's awakened Juliet notices all too soon that her Romeo is feverish and faltering, and he confesses that, believing her to be dead, he has taken poison. It is too late. The dream was too beautiful, he says. His thoughts run back, with more meaning now, to their wedding night, when they first heard the song of the lark heralding the dawn, and hoped it was the nightingale singing in the darkness. Now it is into eternal darkness that they will pass.
L'alouette déjà nous annonce le jour. Non, non, ce n'est pas le jour. Ce n'est pas l'alouette. C'est le doux rossignol, confident de l'amour.
He falls from her arms. Quickly she takes up the flask that had contained the poison, finds it empty, takes up the dagger she has hidden near her breast, and then quietly ends her life as he too dies. Her next to last words are "Je t'aime," I love you. But then, as we have just heard, Gounod's librettists, concerned that Shakespeare's ending might offend bourgeois audiences of the théâtre lyrique, have the lovers, like good Catholics, ask God to forgive them their sin of suicide. That, again, is jarringly un-Shakespearean. We also miss in Gounod, who is still following Garrick's revision, Shakespeare's essential reconciliation of the two warring families over the dead bodies of the young lovers. Gounod wanted to end his opera with one last love duet. He knew his own strengths. Perhaps none of the four duets in Romeo achieves the extraordinary sensuousness of the single protracted love duet in Faust, but they are all nonetheless fine examples of Gounod's intimate style, a new and elegant French style that opposed the established traditions of grand opera as dictated by the Paris Opéra. Gounod's duets, passionate yet intimate, and often close to the inflections of the French language, pointed away from Meyerbeer and the establishment, towards the smaller-scaled and more expressive music of Bizet's Pearl Fishers, Lalot's Roi Dix, and Massenet's Werther. It was the beginning of a new sense and sensibility in French opera. In the end, Tchaikovsky's telling of the tale may be more starlit, and Bellini's more cantabile, and Prokofiev's more compelling, and Berlioz's more varied and imaginative. But Gounod's score is unparalleled among musical treatments of Shakespeare's play for sweetness, for Gallic elegance, and most remarkably for the unprecedented number of its occasionally interrupted love duets. One of Gounod's many pupils, the conductor Henri Bousset, once asked him what the secret of his art was. Gounod replied, "Melody alone counts in music. Melody, always melody, my son." Some composers, of course, will not agree with that, but how many of them can turn speech into melody, paint with melody, make poetry with melody, as Gounod does in the garden scenes of his operas, when young love first awakes to wonder. Melody, he told young Bousset, is the purest expression of human thought.